See how many comes on this morning.
Facebook Live.
Yeah, they ain't nobody. Oh, we got one.
Are we already live?
Yeah, I usually start it a minute or so ahead so that it'll.
So the people can.
Yep, so
Do their thing.
people can join in.
Alright, well, you gonna record this then?
Yeah. Is it not?
Paused.
Oh, it's paused.
Yeah.
Hey, Nina.
There.
Burn
Okay, yeah.
Sandy just sent a message saying her browser doesn't support Zoom, and I had the same problem, but I just went to the Zoom app and put in the meeting code. The link looks different than what it normally does.
Oh, really? They must have updated it or something then. I can't get there. Somebody tell Sandy to go to zoom.us and type in the number. If Sandy's listening, go to zoom.us and type in the meeting code ID, and then it should work.
You got her number?
I just texted her.
Okay.
Yeah.
You and I were texting back and forth anyway.
If you're watching on Facebook Live, we're trying to get started. It's a rainy morning. We're all in slow motion today.
Slow mo. Alright, well anyhow, it's time to get started in Lamentations chapter 3 is where we're at this week, and you know, moving right on through this book. And Sandy, I don't know if you can hear us, but she pointed out the poetic aspect of Lamentations, and it goes way over my head really, but you know, there's something to be said with that, about the 22 verses in all the chapters except for 3, and then chapter 3 has 66 if you look, and you know, the poetic aspect of it is just that, you know, it was written from a man's heart, and no doubt a gift that God had given Jeremiah, this poetic thought, you know, that he had in a time that you know, he's seen all around him laid waste, and the ones he loved had been carried away or killed and treated bad in all sorts of ways. And looking ahead to today, someone with a poetic mindset, such as maybe a songwriter or whatever, you know, they have that gift that, you know, as Sandy pointed out, if you were so minded to, you could make a song from this writing of Jeremiah's here, and but it definitely comes from a broken heart, what Jeremiah writes down, and we'll get into the midpoint of Jeremiah's writings this week, chapter 3. If you've not found your way there, why, go right ahead and turn in your Bible. And as always, we'll start out with a word of prayer this morning. Father in heaven, thank you for loving us, and Lord, for the chance to study your word here one more time this morning. Lord, to look into the words that you inspired Jeremiah to write down so long ago, and Lord, words that we can relate to the time that we're living in today. We see trials and troubles all around us. We see our friends, family, and loved ones that, Lord, are suffering in one way or another, as Jeremiah's family and friends were. Guide us, Lord, through this, and Lord, give us from your word what you want us to have. And help us, Lord, to use it to be doing your blessed will. And Lord, in spite of our shortcomings, may your will be done. And may you take us where we should go this morning. And may your will be done. In Jesus' name I pray. And amen.
Amen.
All right, not Jeremiah, but Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 1.
Hold on, I can't hardly hear you. Let me see if maybe
Can
my
you hear
volume.
me?
Let me turn my volume
We're
up.
having technical difficulties on Facebook
right.
Live. All right, now
If
maybe
you're on-
we're good.
If y'all can hear on Facebook Live, if you can hear Keith, give me a thumbs up, somebody. That way I
Thumbs up.
know or something.
Yes, no, maybe. All right.
There you go. Speak up one.
All right, I'll try. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 1 says, I am the man that hath seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He hath led me and brought me into darkness, but not into light. And surely against me he turned. He turneth his hand against me all the day. My flesh and my skin hath he made to old. He hath broken my bones. And he hath builded against me, and compassed me with gall and travail. He hath set me in dark places, as they that be dead of old. He hath hedged me about, that I cannot get out. And he hath made my chain heavy. Also, when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayer. And he hath enclosed my ways with hewn stone, and he hath made my paths crooked. He was unto me as a bear lying in wait, and as a lion in secret places. He hath turned aside my ways, and pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate, and he hath bent his bow, and set me as a mark for the arrow. He hath caused the arrows of his quiver to enter into my reins. I was a derision to all my people, and their song all the day. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunk with wormwood. And he hath also broken my teeth with gravel stones. And he hath covered me with ashes. And thou hast removed my soul far off from peace. And I forgot prosperity. And I said, my strength and my hope is perished from the Lord. And we'll stop right there and talk about those few verses. And you know, you can just picture Jeremiah here with a broken heart. And the first couple chapters, he was kind of pointing to those around him as to what they were enduring. But here, he is talking about Jeremiah personally, seems like. You know, he's talking about how this is affecting Jeremiah's heart, how Jeremiah feels about what's going on here. And he begins right there with that he has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. You know, I watched a thing a few minutes ago on Facebook, a man talking about things put in the hands of men that can do that job with that thing in their hand. And think about that, the rod of God and the wrath that he could pour out with that. And you know, Jeremiah is feeling that wrath, you know, for, you know, his own shortcomings, for Israel as a whole, that they had, you know, been chastised here by God. And God is using the Nebuchadnezzar's armies to afflict them, you know, to put them under their hand, to use them as a tool of judgment. And then verse 3, you know, think about that. Surely against me he is turned. You know, what a thought to think that God the Father is against you. I mean, who could stand against that? And then, you know, just think about being under such affliction that it seems like even God is against you. And that is how Jeremiah's feeling here. And then he talks about, he hath hedged me about, and he can't get out. You know, maybe Jeremiah's thinking about when they were under siege. You know, when they were under siege, here they were behind this wall in the city, and they were starving to death, and they were doing without. And outside the doors, there was this armies of Nebuchadnezzar out there, no doubt singing and having a big time and taunting them day in, day and night for asking them, where's your God now? Your God's out here with us, maybe they said. And he's got you under judgment. And he's using us, maybe they said something like that. And here Jeremiah's pointing that out. He hedged me about. He's put a hedge, not a protection around me. You know, we talk about the hedge of protection being around us sometimes. But imagine a hedge around you that keeps you from that protection of God. You know, a stone wall like Jeremiah was behind. And he has made my chain heavy, Jeremiah says. He is under affliction, in captivity in his own home, we might say. And in verse 8, when I cry and shout, he shuts out my prayer. What a dark place to be, that you come to the place where you feel like God is not hearing your prayer. God has shut out Jeremiah's prayer, he says, when I cry and shout. Is anybody ever been under such a broken heart for a circumstance, for a loved one, that you have cried out and shouted out in prayer, you know, for that circumstance, for that loved one? And you know, Jeremiah is there, and he said, God has shut out my prayer. And in the next few verses, God is comparing God the Father to an enemy, you know, to an adversary. He starts out there with a bear lying in wait, and as a lion, you know, a lion will hide in the bushes and attack a gazelle or whatever that goes by, and maybe a bear does something similar to that. It talks about lying in wait for him. He compares God to being an enemy like a lion. And then he's talking about God being like an archer. He's bent his bow toward him. You know, some of you hunt, and some of you have hunted with arrows, and what a devastating tool that is, you know, to kill with. And think about that. Comparing God to an archer that's seeking to do him in. That's seeking to use his arrow to cause his hurt, to enter into his range, you know, to shoot him in the gut, for what we might think of in 21st century language. Verse 13 says, into my range, you know, shot through with an arrow, to die a slow, painful death. And he talks about filling him with bitterness and, you know, making him angry for the circumstances going on around him. Bitterness, you know, hard feelings toward the circumstance that he's in. And then in verse 16, you know, this thought come to me, think about this. He talks about he's broken my teeth with gravels. I sure hope I can get this picture across of where maybe Jeremiah got this thought from. You know, at that time they had a threshing floor there where they separated the grains, and they done it on like a big cleared out place. And they separated the grains and the stuff where they could make bread with. And time went by, and the grain was gone. And maybe they went and swept up the remnants of small pieces of grain around, and they made bread with it. And imagine biting into that piece of bread that was made from that. And there's a gravel in that. And maybe Jeremiah did that. He bit into that gravel and it broke his tooth when he bit into that last bite of bread that he had during this hard time that they were behind the wall here. And Jeremiah has called remembrance that time, you know, that last bread that he thought maybe he would get. And here they are behind this wall. And this, I feel like, is Jeremiah's own personal account of his suffering right through these few little verses here. And he's talking about, and then verse 18, what a dark place to be in. You know, I've heard all of us say before in the past, the Lord is my hope, God is my strength and my refuge. But listen to what Jeremiah says in verse 18. My strength and my hope is perished from the Lord. Jeremiah has given up hope, he says. It's a dark place to be in, folks, you know, where we have just come to our last resort. We've given up hope and come to that place where we feel like God has given up on us. And that's kind of where Jeremiah is right here at this time. All right, anybody got anything to add? Anything on this?
Keith, I kind of thought, especially these first few verses when Jeremiah was thrown into the cistern
Yeah,
in the courtyard.
yeah,
Yeah.
the king had put him in prison there, you know.
Yep.
And, you know, maybe this is, you know, looking back to that place, Vern, because he was no doubt in a dark place. If you go back and read in Jeremiah where that account's given, you know, he's talking about being sunk up in the mud, you know, what we would call it
Yeah.
today. All right, good point. Anybody else? All right, then. If everybody's satisfied with that, we'll move right on then. Nobody on Facebook Live got nothing? All right.
Not yet.
We'll move right on then. This verse 19 says, remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall, my soul hath them in remembrance and is humbled in me. This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning, and great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul, and therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for him. To the soul that seeketh him, it is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth, and he sitteth alone and keeps silence, because he hath borne it upon him. And he putteth his mouth into the dust, if so be that there may be hope. He giveth his cheek to him that smiteth him, and he is filled full with reproach. Alright, we'll stop right there for a few minutes, and Jeremiah kind of changes gear here a little bit. You know, the last few verses we've seen his heart just absolutely broken, feeling like that God has pushed him away, pushed him out of the picture. But here we find Jeremiah calling to mind that God is still in control. Just like here in 2020, you know, we see things going on around us that are so strange to us. But good news, God is still in control. And Jeremiah is calling that right here. And verse 20 points out what Jeremiah remembers that God is using this for. He's using this time that they are suffering through. He's finding out that God is using this for a humbling occasion. It says, my soul, verse 20 says, hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. Sometimes we need to be humbled, don't we? You know, sometimes we get a little proud of ourselves, you know. We think, look at what I've done, you know. And here in the 21st century, we think, we have got it all figured out. We have figured out how to do heart surgeries. We can do all these things. Eddie Morgan is a walking, talking testimony of what a good heart doctor can do. And in many circumstances we see doctors can do great and wonderful things to heal our bodies. But just look at what has happened over the last few months. One little virus has put us all in our houses. It's put us all back. Maybe God's using that for that little word right there, that humbled. Maybe God's using that to humble us. Maybe he's using that to get us back to where we belong, to a place where we can seek Him, a place where we're not putting our trust and our faith in our activities outside in the world, our sports and our pleasures that we partake of day in, day out. Maybe God's using that to humble us. And Jeremiah is pointing out how God has humbled him. Verse 21 says, therefore have I hope. We have hope, people. We have hope in what's to come, you know. It's a dark time that we're going through right now, but somewhere in God's due time, the sun's going to come out. You know, the sun is going to shine, and on the other side we're going to say, God has led us through this. Just like Jeremiah is saying here. And then verse 22 and 23, you know, reminds me of an old gospel song. You know, talking about the Lord's mercies, that we're not consumed, and His compassions fail not. And then they are new every morning. Think about that old song. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is God's faithfulness. And I'm not going to sing. You don't want me to sing. I promise you don't. But, you know, think about that. It comes to mind about how great is God's faithfulness. You know, in these dark times that Israel was going through, the Lord's mercies and His compassions fail not. And, you know, if you look back in Old Testament writings, there were promises that God made to Israel. That if they done this would happen, you know. And if they served God, that God would honor that God would prosper them, and that God would make a great nation of them. But if they did just the opposite, if they turned away from Him, that God would turn away from them. And you know what? We have that same promise today. You know, if we serve God, He is faithful to deliver us through. But if we turn our backs on Him, He is going to turn His back on us. But here it is, you know, plain and simple. God's mercies are great, and they're new every morning. Good news, people. God's mercies are brand new every morning. All right, anything to add there before we move on? All right, moving right on then. And then verse 26, kind of a little insight on our prayer life right here. Verse 26 is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. You know, our prayers, you know, God hears them. God hears our prayers, you know, and it's in His own will how He answers them. How He answered our prayers may not be to our liking every time, but the answer that we get will be the right one for us at the right time. And it's pointing out here, you know, quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. And another song that brings to mind, you know, stand still and let God move, you know. That's all God wants is us and us alone, you know, to stand still and just wait on Him, to give Him the chance. And then verse 27, here's one for you young guys. Here's one that is for you. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. You know, if in your youth, you know, hard times come to you, if God uses something to mold you and make you and bend you into what you should be, you know, how much better is it for you? Because Jimmy's talked in the past about doing grafting limbs from one tree onto another, about being infatuated and intrigued by how that can be done. But when a person does that, he don't go out and pick an old tree. He don't go out and pick an old vine to graft one thing onto another. He picks a young one. He gets a good one that is susceptible to, you know, that bearing that yoke for that painful time, for being bent and molded into something that can be useful for God. And there it is, plain and simple. Bear the yoke in his use. And think about that too. You know, folks of all ages get saved every single day. But it is a proven fact that most folks who get saved in their youth. And here's a testimony to that. It is good for a man to bear that yoke in his youth. And then he sitteth alone and keeps silence, because he hath borne it upon him. You know, sit there and let God have his way in your heart. Let him have his way in your life. And then he putteth his mouth into the dust so that there may be hope. You know, humble himself. One more time, there it is, talking about being humbled. For God humbling you so that there may be hope. And then he giveth his cheek to him that smiteth him. And yeah, no doubt Jeremiah had seen this carried out. It was these soldiers that had came in there and taken them captive. You know, no doubt they were struck by the soldiers, been treated horribly, without a doubt. And he's calling on them to turn the cheek to them. But, you know, if you look forward a couple thousand years, over in the book of Matthew, there's another one that turned the other cheek, one that offered up his cheek to the ones that were persecuting him. Matthew 5:39, if you want to turn up there. And this says that good old red writing. You know, we've talked about the red writing in the past and what the red writing represents. Some of you that may not know, the red writing represents the words of Jesus Christ. And Matthew 5:39 says, "But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, for when hard times come upon you, take it." You know, because it very well be that God has allowed it to come there. Going on, it says, "But whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other one also." There it is, words from Jesus Christ himself, you know. Somebody's treating you bad, don't return evil for evil. Turn the other cheek to them, you know. Is that hard? Absolutely. Our own flesh and blood that we are captive in wants us to retaliate. But Jesus Christ himself told us, turn the other cheek, you know, to be a witness through that. You know, when they're doing you wrong, offer up that other cheek and be that witness to that person that's treating you bad. Alright, y'all ain't talking much this morning. Now's your chance if you've got something to add. Alright then, we'll move right on. Verse 31. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion, according to the multitude of his mercies. For he doth not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men, to crush under his feet all the prisoners of the earth, to subvert a man in his cause. The Lord approves not. Who is he that saith? And it cometh to pass, when the Lord commandeth it not, out of the mouth of the Most High proceedeth not evil and good. Wherefore doth a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search and try our ways, and turn again to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts with our hands unto God in the heavens. For we have transgressed and rebelled, and thou hast not parted. Thou hast covered with anger and persecuted us. Thou hast slain, and thou hast not pitied. Thou hast covered thyself with a cloud, that our prayers should not pass through. And thou hast made us as the offscouring and refuse in the midst of the people. And all our enemies have opened their mouths against us. A fear and a snare has come upon us, desolation and destruction. All right. Quit right there for a minute and you know, and I guess I've got a bad habit of trying to get all the way through a chapter, and you know, there's quite a few verses in this chapter, and if someone feels like I've overlooked something or passed something up, why, please speak right up and point it out. And maybe it's my own shortcoming that I always try to get through a chapter. But going on, verse 31 says, "The Lord will not cast off forever." You know, God had, for lack of a better word, kind of turned his back on Israel this time. But Jeremiah points out there that the Lord will not cast us off forever. You know, he will take them back in. And going right on, Jeremiah points out that verse 33, that it is not God's will that he chastise them. Not God's will that he has to judge them. Because, you know, looking back in Deuteronomy, it talks about the promise that God gave them. And we spoke a little bit about this a minute ago, that how God made that promise, that if they would honor God's will for their life, that he would bless them. And we might as well turn back and look at that. And Deuteronomy chapter 28 talks about that. Deuteronomy 28, verse 1. Says, "It shall come to pass that if thou shalt hearken diligently to the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and do his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord." But we'll turn forward a few verses in that same chapter and to verse 15. And this is the other side of that promise. It says, "But it shall come to pass that if you shall not hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shall thou be in the city, cursed shall thou be in the field, cursed shall be thy basket and thy store, cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, and the increase of thy kind, and the flocks of the sheep. And cursed shall thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shall thou be when thou goest out." And I could go right on there with that, but you know, that's enough, as the saying goes. And that's kind of what Israel's going through right now. The promise that God made to them. Because they, just like we do from time to time, had, you know, put God in a little box somewhere, you know, put him in a place where we can take him out when we need him. And maybe that's where we're at today, you know. Maybe we've not honored God like we should. And maybe that curse has come upon us that we're getting today, just like Israel was getting at this time. And then, moving right on down to verse 39, "Wherefore, or why, doth a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sin?" Think about that. When God punishes you or me for our shortcomings, our wrongdoings that we willingly do, why do we complain about it? You know? Why do we ask, "Why, God? Why have you allowed this to come upon me?" And we're all guilty of that. We all say, "Why, God, have you let this come upon us?" And that's what Jeremiah is pointing out there. And in verse 40 gives the answer to that. It says, "Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord." You know, examine yourself, you might call that. Look at our actions. Look at what we're doing. Are they honoring unto God? And that's what Jeremiah is pointing out. Examine yourself and see where you stand before God. And I will have to say that you're not on the same level plateau with God. You fall way short. And then 41 has the answer to that. Let us lift up to our hearts with our hands unto God in the heavens. For lack of a better word, pray for forgiveness. Pray that God would bring us back to where we need to be in life. Pray that God would bring us back into the fold, that God would help us to be useful. God would help us to be His, to serve and to do what He'd have us to do. Alright, anything else? Where did I quit reading that? I forgot now. 42? Yeah, 42. Let's start back at 42. Alright, anybody got anything to add? I don't see no fingers reaching for buttons. Alright, on we go then. It says we, Jeremiah's talking about Israel, but you know, in modern day language we can say we, me, Jimmy, Vern, Eddie, Alan, all of us, we have transgressed and rebelled, and thou hast not pardoned. Thou hast covered with anger and persecuted us. Thou hast slain, and thou hast not pitied. Thou hast covered thyself with a cloud, that our prayers should not pass through. Thou hast made us as the offscouring and refuge in the midst of the people. And all our enemies have opened their mouths against us. And fear and a snare is come upon us, desolation and destruction. So, like we said there, we have all transgressed and rebelled. You know, rebelled. Think about that word. You know, once upon a time, we were divided as a nation. Parts of our nation rebelled against the other part, and we were split, you know. Maybe we as God's people have rebelled a little bit. We have strayed away from what He had for us. But then we find God's reaction to that. It says, thou hast not pardoned. You know, God has judged. God has not pardoned there. Thou hast covered with anger. You know, think about that. God's anger. The very being that created all that we stand on. And God didn't use methods that we would use to create, to make things. God spoke into existence all that we stand upon, the air that we breathe, all that we have to rely on. God created it with His voice. And if He can create with His voice, imagine what God could do with His anger that He's talking about. That was covered with anger and persecuted us. You know, what they were suffering through, being under siege for over a year, how much time had went by since being under siege as to what we see now. I don't have that answer, but Jeremiah is seeing these hard times. Thou hast slain us, persecuted us, and not pitied. You know, sometimes we see somebody that's fell on hard times and we have pity on them, don't we? You know, we feel sorry for what they're suffering through and we want to help them. God has turned His back on them here. It says He's not pitied. And then verse 44, you know, Jeremiah talked a little bit about this in the beginning of the chapter. But here it is again. He's covered Himself. God has covered Himself with a cloud that our prayers can't get through. God does not want to hear the prayers that Israel has. And then, thou hast made us as the offscouring and refuge in the midst of the people. Offscouring. Sometimes when you cook something in a pan, and I've been known to burn it a little bit every once in a while. When you get done, you get ready to clean up, and you scratch that out of that skillet. That's the offscouring right there. The unusable part, the part you scrape out.
The scum. My version says
Nana's
scum.
Bible, she's got another version, and it calls it the scum. The parts you clean up, the parts you get rid of. That our prayer can't pass through it. God's not listening. You know, what a dark place. That God will not hear your prayer. And that is where Israel is at here. And all their enemies have opened their mouths against us. You know, Jeremiah would have related what like a lion or a bear would do. A lion or a bear or a mean dog or whatever would open his mouth against them. Would come out ready to bite, ready to do them harm. And that's what Jeremiah is comparing it to. Their enemy has come at them and swallowed them up with their mouth against them. And then fear and a snare has come upon us. A snare. A lot of people at this time, when they would have hunted, they would have hunted with a snare. You know, they would set a trap. And an animal would have got caught in. And Jeremiah is talking about that snare they're caught in here at this time that the enemy had caught them with. And, you know, the old saying, the thought, gloom and doom. And that's what Jeremiah is suffering through here. Gloom and doom. For judgment has come upon Israel. And here they are living in the midst of it. Anybody got anything to add?
Hey Keith,
Yes, sir.
you mentioned there a moment ago that sometimes we look at somebody and it's in bad times and in hard times, we kind of feel pity on them.
Right.
And that doesn't seem to be the case here with God. It doesn't. When we
Right.
read about his fierce anger and stuff, it seems that he's not really looking at us with pity and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I made some notes so I can remember to say this, is that sometimes we look at folks that are in a position or in a predicament and we don't have much pity on them because we think they brought it on themselves.
Yep.
And like because of decisions, because they've made bad decisions and such. And that's kind of what this is right here. You
Yeah.
think that God don't love them, and it's not really that God don't pity them. It's just that God has revealed to them they brought it on themselves.
Yep.
He warned them and he told them, and then they brought it on themselves, and they made that. And the other note that I wrote myself here was that sounds like what some of the things you described is a whole lot like us today.
Yep.
That we, it is as if God has given us warning after warning after warning, and we just continue to ignore. And, so then when judgment comes, they ain't a whole lot of reason for us to cry and pout about it because we brought it on ourselves.
Yep. This is true, and God always keeps his promises. He always keeps his promise. And we read in Deuteronomy God's promise. If Israel honored God's will for their lives, that he would prosper them. But if they didn't honor what he had put in place for them, that he would curse them. And here we're finding the answer to God's promise in this. All right, anything else?
And God had given Israel chance after chance after chance.
Right.
And, like I said last week, I'm reading through the prophets right now in my yearly reading plan and reading Ezekiel. Ezekiel even points out that Judah had seen what happened to Israel, and they still didn't turn from their ways, didn't turn back to God. They just kept doing the same old thing, and that's where they're at here with Jeremiah and Lamentations. Right. It's the result of years and years of not turning back to God.
Absolutely. And you read through the history of Israel, and all down throughout history, they would serve God, and then they would turn back. Serve God and turn back. And fast forward to modern day Christians. Sometimes we're a lot like that. You know, we serve God and then we turn back. We serve God and we turn back. And who's to say God's not ready to judge us for our actions, for what we've done? And, you know, the Bible's full of God's promises, and some of them have, you know, good circumstances for us, and some of them have not so good circumstances. If we honor God's will for our lives, then He will bless us, Lord. All right, anything else? All right, the clock has caught up with us once again.
You didn't get done.
I'm not got done, but you know, that's all right too. There's always next week, and if next week don't never come, then we don't have to worry about it anyway. But anyhow, we'll start in verse 48 next week. We'll pick up right there and move on from that point. And anybody got anything they'd like to add before we stop?
Sandy made a comment a while ago, and I had forgot about it too, but you know, it's not been too long ago that we used to get soup bean bags and they had gravel in them.
Yeah. So soup bean bags with gravel in them. Anybody besides me remember that? I see a few hands right there. Yeah. And you know what we talked about Jeremiah, about his teeth being broken with gravel from that last remnant of grain that they swept up off the floor there. You know, the last that they had. The last that they had. And was what they used. Thanks for that, Sandy. That brings back an old thought right there. All right, anybody else? All right, I guess we'll move on to the next part of Green Hills Church service, which will be special singing on Facebook Live.
So the video's on Facebook Live, or you can watch it here.
Good job, Keith.
Thank you.
Amen. All right, so that video is also on the Green Hill page if anybody wants to go over there and watch it. And we're going to stop this live, and Jim's going to pick up and give him just a minute, and he should be ready to go.